It's a joy to come and share with you this morning, to join with you in a devotion. I came yesterday also, and it was just a lovely time of fellowship. I'm just visiting here for a week. This morning, I would like us to look at the second chapter of Ruth. The story of Ruth is one that we're familiar with. Naomi and her husband go to Moab with two sons. The sons marry, and then first the father and then the sons die, and Naomi is left as a widow with two widowed daughters. There is nothing more pitiful in that culture than to be a widow, but to be a widow without sons is just, she described herself as bitter. The story goes that Ruth journeys with her back to Israel, but they are pitifully poor. And Ruth says she'll go out gleaning. Now, we're familiar with the idea of gleaning only from the Bible. We don't do cropping. But in India, I have seen the labourers harvesting by hand. And it's a hot, dusty, dirty job. And as I was travelling here this morning, I saw, I think they were women with the machines cutting the grass. Could hardly tell if they were men or women. Long, loose clothes, but also covered so that you could only see their eyes. And that's what labourers wear when they're in the field, to protect themselves from the hot sun and the dust. So Ruth, I think, would have looked something like that. And Boaz came from Bethlehem out to his fields, and he noticed her. Now, he's a busy man, clearly. He sits at the gates in Bethlehem. He's in leadership. He's respected. He's got property. He's going out to supervise the harvest. And he's got a large labour force out there he's got the men, the women. But he noticed Ruth. Now, sometimes we might hear the story presented as a love story, that Boaz went, wow, look at her. But I doubt it, because she would have looked like these ladies who were cutting the long grass. You can't tell anything about them. But he noticed that she was there and she was different. And so he said to his men, who does this woman belong to? Now, when he found out, he did 5 things for her. I'm going to keep this brief. He offered her food, he offered her water, and he offered her work. Those are simple, practical things that he could do. But then he also thought about the context that she was in. And she said, and Boaz said to Ruth, stay in my fields. I have instructed my men not to lay hands on you. How many of us as employers would ever confess, would ever even imagine that would be something that we'd have to say to our people? But she was a young, vulnerable woman, and his obligation was to take care of her, because she was there for no other reason. Sure. So, food, water, work, and safety. But then he did something else. He told his workers, that we're looking at Ruth chapter 2, to take out some of the grain that they had bundled up and to leave it for her. That was something extra. That was offering her fruitfulness. Food, water, work, safety and fruitfulness.
Amen.
Now, Boaz knew, because he was a good and righteous man, what his obligations were. He knew about the laws in Leviticus. He knows that when you harvest, you leave the strip next to your boundary so that people can come and glean. And that he must allow her to walk behind and gather grain that has been dropped. But he went beyond that. At the end of this chapter, when he says, "You stay in my fields," Ruth says, "Why is it that you should notice me, a foreigner?" And that reinforces that Boaz noticed someone who's different. I have to say that in my context in India, it's very hard for us to notice people outside of our community. Christians stay with Christians, Muslims stay with Muslims, Hindus stay with Hindus. I can ask my staff in the office, because we're right next to a temple, what's happening there? Now, my staff have lived in Delhi all their lives, and they say, "Oh, I don't know, some Hindu celebration." They've never inquired, they've never wondered. And so we tend to walk through life quite blinkered. This I've noticed in India. I don't know what it's like here in Singapore. But Boaz didn't have his blinkers on, and he saw someone different, and he did what he was obliged to do by the law. These first three things, and then offered safety and fruitfulness. Now, I can leave the devotion there, but I don't want to, because I like to take a link to the New Testament. If we find a pattern in the Old Testament, it's wise to see. So I go to John chapter 4, to the story of the Samaritan woman by the well. And let's just go there now and read the first few verses. John chapter 4. Is it verse 22? No, John chapter 4. Starting at verse 1. Shall we just go around and read it verse by verse for the first 7 verses?
Okay.
John chapter 4,
Verse 1.
starting at verse 1.
Okay.
Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John.
Verse 2. Although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciple.
He left Judea and departed again to Galilee.
Verse 4. And he must needs go through Samaria.
So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph.
Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour.
And when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?"
8.
We'll just leave it at 7 there. Jesus had absolutely nothing. It was the heat of the day at noon. He had left to travel because the Pharisees had heard what he was doing, that he was gaining popularity. He was hungry, he was tired, he was alone, and he was hot. That's quite a pitiful situation to be in. But he did what Boaz did, and he saw the Samaritan woman, and he struck up a conversation. He broke a cultural barrier. Boaz was relating to a foreign woman, and here Jesus goes beyond that and actually strikes up conversation with someone who is doesn't get on well with Jews. And they have a conversation. And he offers her living water. He knew what he had to offer. Whereas Boaz was wealthy, he had fields, he was able to give these 5 things just out of what he had on hand: food, water, work, safety, and fruitfulness. Jesus, like Boaz, and a descendant of Boaz, had nothing, but he was still able to offer the Samaritan woman what he had. So there I can draw our devotion to a close, because it's not out of our wealth that we are giving. It's out of whatever God has given us. And in Jesus' case, he walked with nothing. But they both looked and saw someone different and gave what they had. That's my challenge in India, to take off the blinkers of culture that I have, to challenge my workmates and the people I work with, to see beyond their own community. Maybe people are the same the world round. I'm only learning about that. So, shall we?
Yes.
We'll stop there. We'll take a moment to thank God for the word, and then maybe we can
Yeah.
share.
Yes. Pastor, you got anything you want to add on today's Boaz notice? So